Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to it, except the technology bit. If it all goes technologically wrong, that's because I'm something of a dinosaur, but we'll see what happens. So I was born and grew up in the New Forest. And so from very early on, took an interest in the natural world and especially birds. I was actually confirmed in the Church of England, but lapsed to the Methodists. That's another story. Went off to university and for 8 years taught science. Chemistry was my main subject, but science in secondary schools in Jamaica and Kent. And then I felt called to become a Methodist minister, and was that for 34 years or so. Well, I still am, but now retired. So going back about 40 years ago, when I was training as a Methodist minister, I read an article in a magazine which I think was called Buzz. It was a Christian magazine. Those of you of an ancient age like me might even remember it, but it was about this new project that some Anglican had started, which was to combine really Christianity, a Christian conservation project in Portugal. And as I was interested in conservation and I was a Christian, I pricked up my ears, thought, well, I must find out a little bit more about this. And that was A Rocha. This was pre-internet or anything, so you had to write off for information then. So I wrote off and got some information, and I've been a supporter of A Rocha ever since. I suspect many of you will know more about Eco Church than A Rocha, but as you hopefully know, Eco Church is an A Rocha project. On their leaflet. It says that. So today I really want to just talk a little bit more about the other work that A Rocha does other than Eco Church, and give you a little bit about how they came into being, etc. So I'm going to hopefully share a very short video about A Rocha, and then we'll see a longer one in a little bit. This book, Under the Bright Wings, by Peter Harris, tells the story of the early years of A Rocha. The title alludes to a poem by Gerald Manley Hopkins, God's Grandeur, Under the Bright Wings. And Peter Harris is ordained in the Church of England and a keen bird watcher. He joins an illustrious list of Anglican clergy who were also bird watchers, including Gilbert White, going back, way back, and more recently, people like John Stott, who was a great New Testament teacher and preacher. So Peter Harris and his wife, Miranda, felt called to be missionaries, but missionaries with a difference, because they thought that caring for creation was really part of mission. Now, 40 years ago, this was just, crazy thinking in most people's views. This is long before the 5 marks of mission that the Anglican Church came up with, when the 5th one is to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. In fact, I suspect that the existence of A Rocha partly pushed that agenda for that to be included in the 5 marks of mission. But as I say, 40 years ago, this was an idea that seemed a bit just way out. But they managed to persuade the missionary group that they were involved in, Missionary Society, the BCMS, which I think has now become Crosslinks, though it might have changed something else, but who knows. Anyway, they sent them out to Portugal, to the Algarve, to see if they could set up this field study center, which would do bird ringing and counting of species and trying to conserve the environment and fight off the pressures of developing the land for tourism and things like that. So that's where they were based for many, many years. And that's why A Rocha has a Portuguese name. A Rocha is Portuguese for the rock. And for many years, that was the only project that was A Rocha. And the book is a wonderful catalogue of the early years of mistakes and miracles combined together. They made plenty of mistakes, as they're quite quick to acknowledge, but many wonderful things happened along the way, and the right people turned up at the right time, or the funding came in just when they needed it, and all sorts of things. So read the book for yourself, because it's a wonderful, engaging story. And one of the things that becomes clear is that the whole idea of community and hospitality were at the heart of A Rocha. They had people coming to stay with them, some as students or people doing research projects from the UK and around the world. And they had people coming as volunteers to help, who sort of beginning to catch the vision and said, well, we want to come and have a look, come and stay for 2 weeks or a month or sometimes a year and work with you. So that was the early years of A Rocha, and for 15, maybe even 20 years, that was the only project. And then about 20 years ago, suddenly there seemed to be a number of other countries that were saying, well, we want to do something in our country, link it with A Rocha. And many of the people doing this were people who had volunteered or been research students or so with A Rocha in Portugal, and they'd gone back to their own countries and decided they wanted to do something. And so in Ghana, in India, in America, the States, in Brazil, projects began, A Rocha projects, so that to the extent that today there are A Rocha projects in over 20 countries around the world. The wonderful thing is, unlike McDonald's, which is a franchise where, you go into a McDonald's in the States or Kenya or wherever else it is you go, they're basically all the same. A Rocha projects are wonderfully different depending on the country and just how you started and what particular vision they had. I'll talk a little bit more later, if I have time, about UK, what's happened in the UK, and a project in the UK, which I was able to visit a few years ago. But just to mention India as one of the more maybe strange projects, but A Rocha India decided they wanted to do something about Indian elephants and humans. Because there is an Indian elephant, and they're basically, with the increasing population in India and elephants migrating, you can imagine that this is a disaster waiting to happen, or not even waiting, it's happening, because the traditional migration routes for the elephants, some of them go straight through new villages and communities. And so farmers' crops are spoiled, and sometimes there's a lot of damage done. And sometimes, therefore, violence occurs and elephants are shot, or, so and so on. So A Rocha, India, decided they wanted to do something to try and mitigate the sort of conflict aspect, and see if there was a way of humans and elephants being able to coexist in a peaceful manner. And so they did a lot of research and worked with communities to find if there were particular shrubs and trees that could be planted which would discourage elephants. So they sort of built things around communities and all sorts of things they did. But you have to go on the website to find out more. But that gives you a sort of flavor of one particular project, but all of them are different depending where you go around the world. So I want to now, and just to say that though all these projects are different, they all share the common sort of core values and vision of A Rocha. And I'll be talking about that after the next clip. This is an older clip going back to 2012 or something, but it's about, and it's a bit long, it's about 6 minutes, but it does very much, I think, catch the flavor of the work of A Rocha.
It's a story we hear every day. Forests destroyed, oceans overfished, and the atmosphere polluted. The story of paradise lost. We've changed the face of the earth. We've even changed the climate. It's time we changed. This is the story of A Rocha, a story of change, transformation, restoration, and hope. A Rocha is an international conservation organization that's working to show God's love for all creation. We are committed to environmental action through community-based conservation projects. From helping landowners in France turn their fields back to the original wetlands that once welcomed wildlife, and protecting the Alvor estuary in the south of Portugal with its rich biodiversity, to saving one of the last forests of the African coast, bringing income to desperately poor local villages, A Rocha has grown over the last 2 decades into a global family of projects working on 5 continents.
Yeah, I found this one.
Underlying all we do is our biblical faith in a living God who made the world, loves it, and entrusts it to the care of human society. It's why we're passionate about what we do. It's why what we are has always been somewhat unique in both the conservation and Christian worlds.
What we were trying to do in Portugal in 1983 at the very beginning was to give a practical expression to 2 convictions. The first was that it's a completely normal part of the Christian life to care for God's creation, even if that whole emphasis has rather gone missing from how we understand it to be. But also within the environmental movement, values, beliefs, why we do conservation work has not been talked about very much, although it's actually fundamental. And we wanted to bring that discussion to the foreground, but also to show in practice what Christian convictions would mean if you put them into a working context.
Thank you for each person here. Amen.
Amen. We're now seeing tremendous possibilities for A Rocha developing worldwide, and one particular thing is exciting us, and that is that often where you find biodiversity hotspots, and those are relatively small areas on the planet, you sometimes find major concentrations of Christians as well. And we're looking at those overlap areas, those highly strategic places where if the Christian church gains a vision for really understanding the need and the responsibility to care for creation, there could be enormous impact for good. In conservation terms, A Rocha's vision is quite wide really, because it's to see ecosystems restored, but it's also to see the well-being of those human communities that are dependent upon them. So you're talking about restoration ecology, but at the same time you're sometimes talking about developmental economics or sustainability. It's a very wide vision.
Environmental degradation and climate change hurt poor people the most. There's a misconception that investing in conservation is contrary to investing in people's livelihoods, that it's a luxury. But the idea that you need to get rich first, then worry about your environment, is not only untrue, it's dangerous. The fact is, the majority of the poorest people in the majority of the poorest countries continue to depend heavily on natural resources. However, experts have confirmed that 60% of the world's ecosystems are degraded or unsustainably used. This has direct impact on the livelihoods of the poor. They concluded, if we want to cut in half the number of people living in extreme poverty and meet the Millennium Development Goals to reduce poverty, hunger and disease by 2015, the world's natural resources need to be managed sustainably.
The poor are really more poor in the context of the degraded ecosystem. A Rocha is working to not leave people in such conditions, in terms of allowing people to be really happy to live in a very stable ecosystem. In that sense, A Rocha is, I think, working at the foundation of the poverty. The foundation is the spiritual and the environmental.
The rural poor depend directly on the natural resource base. This is where the pharmacy is, this is where the local supermarket is, this is, in fact, their fuel station, it is their power company, it is their water company. What would happen to you if these things were removed from your local neighborhood?
Sustainable development is very important for the population. And when A Rocha is working for biodiversity and when A Rocha is working against the deforestation, A Rocha is really fighting against poverty. We cannot separate the taking care of the earth and taking care of so many people who are so poor in the world.
All over the world, Christians are waking up to their urgent responsibility to care for God's beleaguered creation. The challenge is to all of us. Time is running out.
So I hope that gave you a flavour for the work of A Rocha. And I wanted to say something just to follow up from that about a vision of A Rocha for a world of stable climate and abundant nature, where oceans, rivers, air and soil are free of human pollution. And they go on to talk about the role of the church and Christians in that vision. On their website, they talk about the 5 C's of A Rocha: Christian, conservation, community, cultural diversity, and collaboration. They are, firstly, unashamedly a Christian charity involved in conservation, and they are sort of upfront about that and not ashamed by that, and they think they have an important part to play. and they open it up, whichever country they're in, they're open about that, but they're also open to working with others. And we'll come on a bit to that later. But it is a Christian charity, and they see care for creation as grounded in the biblical view. But they are involved in conservation. And what I loved about it is that they don't just talk about it, they get on and do it in an amazing number of ways. They're involved with local communities around the world in looking after creation. So they work on the ground. So when they do then talk to local government or national governments, they're talking from a position of, well, we're doing something about it, so why don't you do something as well? And as I said before, community, the third C, is really at the heart of A Rocha. They don't see the world as a place where humans and nature are separate. They see the vision is that communities are so much part of caring for creation. And wherever they work, they try to engage with the local community and to encourage them to play their part. In fact, yes, an A Rocha project wouldn't work without the involvement of local community. And then because of that, it means, and because they're involved in so many countries around the world, there's an amazing cultural diversity of views, and that's seen as something to celebrate rather than a problem, which is good. And then the final C, collaboration. Wherever they are happy to work with other charities, NGOs, governments, local governments, whoever, as long as they share the vision, to find common ground so that together we can care for creation. So I do commend the work of A Rocha to you. And one of the ways they've done that was to take on the what was Eco Congregation, which was sort of a small project involving a couple of hundred churches, I think, and then they changed it to Eco Church 12 years ago or so, and no less than that. And it's now, I gather the latest figures, about 8,000 churches in England and Wales that are registered as eco churches, which is incredible. I would just say in passing that means that they're because they've underwritten it, and but their expenses have multiplied drastically, and I know they've had to employ extra people to cater for all those 8,000 people and to sort of back them up. So if your church is able to give a donation to Eco Church, please do encourage them to do so, because someone's got to pay. So that brings me on to, I wanted to talk a little bit about A Rocha UK, and this is the book God Doesn't Do Waste by Dave Bookless, which is the story, again, as with the previous book, this is the story of how A Rocha UK came into being. This was one of the projects that happened, say, many years after the A Rocha Portugal project was running, and the person who wrote the book, Dave Bookless, another Anglican clergyman, another bird watcher, and he was instrumental and became the first, I can't remember the title, director or whatever of A Rocha UK. But his story begins earlier. And it's a wonderful story of how God works in his amazing way, and plans things, because Dave Bookless was the son of missionary parents who were in India. So he was born in India and spent his early years in India. Came back to be educated in this country, and then went off to university and did, I think, a number of jobs for a while, and then felt called to be to the Anglican ministry, and so applied and was accepted for training. The year before he began his training, he and his wife went on holiday to the Scillies, to St. Martin. I get this was about 20 years ago, I suppose. And at the end of the holiday, they'd had an absolutely wonderful time. They had a week or a fortnight, and the weather was wonderful. And they'd accumulated a certain amount of rubbish, and they thought, well, what do we do? So what they asked somebody, the neighbour, sort of, where do we put our rubbish? Because, you know, obviously they didn't have a bin lorry coming round, and they said, oh, you just take it down the end of the island and you'll see where the rubbish is. So off they trundled to the end of the island, and there, just over the cliff, there was a place where everybody just dumped their rubbish. And so as he did this, Dave Bookless says that he heard that inner voice saying to him, how do you think I feel about what you're doing to my world? And that changed his life. Because when he went back to college to train as a minister, he started looking into the sort of biblical view of creation, and he started reading other people, and he came across an organization that he'd never heard of called A Rocha, and he thought he ought to find out a little bit more about them. So he and his wife actually went on holiday to visit A Rocha, Portugal, a couple of times, and so he became passionate about caring for creation, and thinking that the church needed to do more. He was sent as a curate to Southall in West London, about 15 minutes drive from Heathrow. Let's say Southall is somewhat more multicultural than Cornwall. In fact, when I went there, I mean, it's just amazing. There are, I mean, a huge Asian population, Caribbean population, some Africa from Somalia, and lots of, just, you go down, if you drive down Southall High Street, it is like being in, not Britain as I know it. Absolutely amazing. And it was there that he was sent as a curate. And then after 2 years, he was ordained as a priest and moved to a neighboring parish, but still in Southall. And during that time, because of his bird watching, I suppose, he became aware of an area of land that was somewhat derelict, which was, the title was the Minette Country Park, but it was an area that was used. They had a weekly, or maybe it's a monthly car boot sale there, and everywhere they just left things there afterwards until the next car boot sale. There was a lot of fly tipping that went on there. There were burnt out cars on the site and all sorts of things. And Dave Bookless came up with this crazy idea that, oh, this could be the first A Rocha project in Britain to do something about this area of land, 90 acres or so of prime land for development, but it was a green space, albeit a trashed green space. And so he started talking with people from the local community, including their local MP, who was very supportive of the idea. And in the end, they because it was the local council who actually owned the land, but didn't have the money to do anything with it, or at least that was their excuse. And they came to an agreement to lease the site, or at least part of the site. And so A Rocha UK was launched in 2001. So 23 years ago now. and teams of volunteers came in and cleared the site, and they had contractors coming in to clear some of the area. A lot of people wouldn't go to the site, local people, because of the history of drugs and violence that was associated with the area, but gradually they got more and more involved for the local community. The local Sikh temple was very keen. They had a number of working parties working there, and in a few years they actually had an amazing transformation of this site. There's an old canal that runs through part of it. You would have seen on the first, the longer film clip, there was a little bit which showed some people doing some bird ringing. That was at the Minette Country Park. And they've had, as well as woodpeckers and jays, kingfishers, and they had a bee orchid coming up through the being established, and a lot of other things. So, and they did things like open for school trips and community groups to be shown round, and it became a place for the community. In, we think, about 15 years ago, I suppose it would have been, as part of my sabbatical, we Methodist ministers are allowed a sabbatical of 3 months every 7 years. And as part of a sabbatical, I was able to visit Southall for a week or so, and stayed at what was then the A Rocha Centre, and met some of the people working there, met Dave Bookless, and visited the site. And as I say, it was for me a sort of a cultural, firstly a cultural shock, to having spent most of my time in rural areas or semi-rural or small towns in Britain, to go to West London, Southall, and see just how cosmopolitan the population was. I mean, we white people were very much in the minority in the community, and you can, it sort of gave me an insight really into how the pressure that some people feel, who've grown up in those areas and seen them changed, I mean, dramatically in their lifetimes. But the wonderful sense of here was the community coming together to care for creation and create this green space, and such a, something that had been, well, really a wasteland, had been transformed by this vision and by the community working together. So it was really encouraging to see. And since then, the original, I think the original lease has run out, and they've had to relinquish some of the lease, but they've still got a project there which is called Wolf Fields. So I think some of the land has been, the council has decided to develop, but the Wolf Fields Reserve is still a going concern. So that's great. We're nearly out of time, so I won't show you my other clip. But just to say, the books are still available on eBay or whatever, wherever if you get your books from. I'll give Rosie the details, and she can circulate them if she likes. And but also, of course, there's a lot more information on the website, either for A Rocha International, the A Rocha website, or A Rocha UK. So if you want to know more, do look. But if there are any questions, if we've got a couple of minutes, if anybody's got questions, I'm happy to try and answer them.
That's wonderful to hear that inspirational story from Southall. I mean, I do know, I've driven through Southall, and my word, yes, it's extraordinary, isn't it? It's And to think that they were blessed by that guy coming along and doing that for them. I mean, that must have been inspirational. Wonderful.
And what's wonderful, because of Dave's parents and he's growing up in India, and he had a sort of a natural sort of link in his way with the community, and he felt at home there going back, and it was just, you know, wonderful how it worked out.
God placed him there, didn't he?
Yeah.
God placed him there. Absolutely wonderful. Lovely to hear. Thank you.
Question from Anne.
Yeah, I was just interested right at the beginning of what you were saying was about where there are a lot of poor people, there's also an awful lot of the sort of the biodiversity, the really important places. Where can you find out more about that? I just find that really quite fascinating.
Well, probably if you go on the A Rocha website, I think you'll probably find it there. But yes, it is. It's three things. It's biodiversity hotspots, and yes, a lot of poverty. But also, the third thing is where the church is growing. Right. So particularly in parts of Africa and Central America and some parts of Asia, where the church is growing, there are biodiversity hotspots. So it's, you know, if you can get the church involved in those countries, then they can sort of, as it were, punch above their weight. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we've got Wendy now.
Sorry about that. The interface on my Zoom seems to have changed with a mute button in a different place. If when you're trying to register Eco Church, you go to the A Rocha site. So they're doing tremendous work about, you know, collecting together all the churches and giving all the ideas what we can all do. So that must be a huge administrative contribution, isn't it?
Yes.
Can you tell me more about it?
Well, yes, and just to say, it might be worth, as you should have been notified, but they're doing a major revamping or an upgrade or whatever they call it, a version of Eco Church, and they've introduced a new system, which is, I think, quite similar to the old system, but they've sort of tweaked it. They've learned from mistakes, and so the new system is already launched. So if you register now, you go onto the new system. But they're phasing out the old system, and so if you started working towards an award and you're nearly at your bronze or your silver, or you've got till the end of January to apply for an award. After that, you've got to start again on the new system. So it's worth knowing that that's happening. But I mean, yes, I mean, I think again all the time. This A Rocha, I guess, like many smaller charities, but it is run on a shoestring, and they commit to something and they don't really know where the money's coming from. And I think with taking on Eco Church, they thought we've got to do this because otherwise it's going to fold, and it's too good to fold. So we'll take it on, but I think they didn't realize quite how it was going to go. And on the one hand, they're absolutely delighted that it has flourished in the way it has. But as you can imagine, going from, you know, a couple of hundred churches to 8,000 churches in under 10 years has been, you know, gives them a huge headache in terms of how to administer it. So sometimes when you phone up, they say, "Oh, I'm sorry, we're just, you know, we can't deal with this just yet. You'll have to wait because there's a long queue." But that's just, you know, that's a lovely problem to have.
I will say that centrally, because so much of the Church of England's net zero work has goals that align all the way through it with Eco Church and A Rocha, that centrally the Church of England is providing a small amount of additional funding to A Rocha.
Yeah.
But the recommendation is that whenever you register with them, I think they have a suggested donation of something like £150. And we have always said, and we built this into our budget for creation care, that where churches are unable financially to meet that, because of being a small congregation or not having any reserves or whatever that might be, we are happy to support that with 50% of the donation. And similarly, when you come to get your award plaque, the same is true. So if you're a church sitting on huge amounts of reserves and life is good, I'm not going to give you that money. But if you're a church that really can't make this work, we would love to support you. And I work very closely with the team at Eco Church to look at how we can help improve the national way of funding them as well. We're kind of running a couple of hidden pilot projects just to actually get dioceses to take greater responsibility in enabling this work, and bearing in mind that it works across all of the denominational churches and others, and so it's a huge amount of resource. We talk about well over 8,000 churches in play.
I know a young person who's been a volunteer on a project in Canada and Kenya with A Rocha, and she's had it's really good work they're doing, and she's really enjoyed it.
And if the conversation ever comes up in your own church setting about if the costs of helping your church become net zero are too high or just not doable because the fabric won't let you, and you start to wonder about the language of offsetting, which is to take your carbon emissions and to invest equally against your carbon emissions in something that's carbon positive, then A Rocha run an organisation called Climate Stewards as well, and we heartily recommend engaging with them. And they offer trustworthy ways of offsetting that's not greenwashing and that isn't corrupt. I will also say that we're trying to do a really fun project at the moment, which kind of is growing out from Cornwall, but we're asking all the questions, which is the reality that many churches have some amount of land around them. And lots of our churches are very small emitters of CO2 because of the hours of use or other things. Can we do a measured project to demonstrate that the land the church has in its care, around it in its curtailage, has the ability to have a level of offsetting against the churches? Does that land produce enough biodiversity net gain that it has some element to offset the church gathering in as humans? So there's some fun going on there.
So Luggan Churchyard, which has got lots of really big mature trees, is actually doing a little bit of offsetting naturally, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So churchyards are incredible places because the soil is not turned in a regular fashion as so much land is. So they are extraordinary, really quite unique habitats. And so there's lots of conversations with A Rocha about how we might do that. And as a diocese, because we are utterly committed to this, we're also having a conversation with the leadership of A Rocha at the moment about the potential of joining them in a program called Partners in Action, which is more than just being an eco-diocese. It's actually saying we will partner with you and we'll look to use some of our diocesan glebe land, so some of the land we own, to specifically look for biodiverse projects that we could work together. So there's some really good things going on. I can't recommend A Rocha highly enough. They, you can deal with them with confidence. Andrew, thank you so much for all that you've shared. And it was great to be reminded of all of that, actually. They are such an extraordinary organisation. I remember as a 20-something being in church and a friend of mine saying, have you heard about A Rocha? This thing that's happening? And it was only in Portugal then. And it's been extraordinary to watch how both they've been blessed by God's favour, but also just how as the drumbeat of this essential work has increased across the world, how they've grown with it. And at the same time, I'm saddened to think that that film was probably some 12 plus years old. And the conversation then was saying, we haven't got much time and we're still saying the same thing. So when will we act? And here you are as a gathering of people who are acting, who are cherishing creation, cutting carbon, speaking up. But we need more of it.
Yeah. And just to say one of the things I didn't say, that COP29, which is happening now, there are several people from A Rocha projects actually at COP29, representing their countries or whatever. So they are involved at it's the local and the international level. They span all those sort of areas really, which is great.